We started looking at the Gospel of Matthew. Last week, we began looking at Jesus' kingdom ethics, his teaching, in Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 7. It is the largest block of Jesus' teaching that we have in the Gospels, Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 7. We have come to refer to it as the Sermon on the Mount. And we've already seen that before Jesus began his Sermon on the Mount and begins to teach his kingdom ethics, he began by announcing that the kingdom of heaven had come. The kingdom had come because the king had come. Jesus was here, and as Jesus has come to earth, he came to establish God's kingdom. Throughout the Sermon on the Mount, we see him use that phrase, kingdom of heaven, several times, or other times he just refers to the kingdom. So that idea of God's kingdom was introduced before this sermon, and then throughout the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is speaking about the kingdom. What does that mean? The kingdom is that realm where God is ruling, where things are functioning according to the way that God wills them to be, the way God has designed them to be. That's what it means to be in the kingdom of God. The kingdom has come where God's will is being done. And it's not primarily about a place. It's God's sphere of realm. Wherever God's will is being done, his kingdom is taking place. So we talked about that. And when we talk about God's kingdom, we are talking about a word that in Hebrew we refer to, or it's the Hebrew word shalom. Shalom. Shalom is a word that we translate in our English with the word peace. But the word shalom, peace does not justify the meaning of this word shalom. It is not sufficient to really convey all that this word means, the shalom that God has come to bring us. Shalom is wholeness. Shalom is about things functioning as God designed them to function. Shalom is when things are happening the way God wills them to happen. So to make it real simple, shalom is when God's will is being done. Shalom is when God's will is being done. And so when Jesus came to announce the kingdom, he's come to announce that I have come to bring God's shalom on earth. And Jesus himself is the embodiment of God's shalom. What that means is Jesus himself is the embodiment of God's will being done. Jesus lived that perfect righteous life. In doing that, he's brought God's shalom to earth. Now, we know that full shalom will not arrive until Jesus returns. Jesus is coming back one day, and when he comes back, we will have the fullness of God's shalom. What that means is that when Jesus comes back, he's going to put an end to sin and Satan. Maybe I need to say that again. I don't know if you don't seem too excited about that. You ought to be. He's going to put an end to sin and Satan once and for all. And when he puts an end to sin and Satan, you know what that means? That means that along with that come an end to all sickness, suffering, sorrow, and death will be done away completely. And we long for that day when Jesus comes home, comes to gather us. And then he ushers us into the new creation, the new heavens and new earth, where we have shalom. We have no sin, no Satan, no sorrow, no sickness, no suffering, no death. What we have is the glory of God, the love of God, the presence of God forever and ever and ever. This is the hope of the Christian. This is what we are looking forward to. But Jesus doesn't just give us a picture of a kingdom we're looking forward to in the future. Jesus tells us that now that he has come, God is already beginning to build his kingdom on earth as he redeems people and turns those people into a community, the community that we call the family of God or the church. God begins to work in our lives, and as he works in our lives, the Spirit begins, it's not completed, but he begins to transform us into the image of Christ so that we might reflect the righteousness of Christ. And in doing that, the church becomes what we learned about last week, the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Jesus' people are called the salt of the earth and the light of the world, and we will be that as long as we allow the Holy Spirit to work in our lives, fill our lives, and transform us into the image of God, reflecting the righteousness of God, living in the power of God. That is the beautiful picture that we have, and Jesus is already doing that. If I have your permission, I would like to go on a little rant right now. Can I go on a little rant right now? I get really upset I get ticked off when I hear people talk about the church in a critical, what I would say slanderous way. And it really bothers me. And I know I need to bring that to Jesus and ask Jesus, just help me. But I don't know about you, but I hear a lot of messages out in the world about how bad Christians are and how bad the church is and the church this and the church that. Let me tell you something. I have been in full-time ministry as a pastor in various churches for the last maybe 37 or so years. That's a long time. That's longer than some of you have been alive. Don't raise your hand right now. It's a long time, and I want to tell you something, that yes, the church is imperfect. We are not a perfect people. We have our flaws. We have our weaknesses. I have experienced myself hurts in ministry. However, I want to say this. I believe that while the church is a little messy, it's a beautiful mess. And I will tell you that in 37 years being involved in ministry in various churches, I have seen so much good, and it far outweighs any of the negative things that I've seen happen in the church. And by the way, in the church, Jesus even said, he said there's going to be wolves in sheep's clothing. There's going to be people that come in and penetrate the church, and they're not going to be true children of God operating in the Spirit of God. But I just want to say to you that God, I have seen God do some wonderful things in the community of faith, the family of God, His church. And I want to just give you a couple. I could spend all day telling you story after story about how I have seen God change people's lives and demonstrate His love through people in the churches that I've been ministering at. But just yesterday, I want to give you a few examples. Just yesterday, during the day, I was teaching a class for our Pendale School of Ministry. That's a school of ministry associated with our fellowship, our denomination, the Assemblies of God. And I was teaching a class with just 4 students, a small class. And during that class, as the students were introducing themselves, we heard a story about a lady who she was basically homeless and had children, and she didn't know what she was going to do, but she began to talk about how the church took her in and her family in, and how she talked about how she was about to be homeless, but how they paid her rent so she wouldn't be homeless, and they cared for her, and she just went on and on about how the church had been the church, what the church is supposed to be, and how it had taken care of her. Another student in the class began to talk about how she's been so blessed by the church she's in now, and the pastor, and how they have loved on her special needs kid. We talk about special needs children. She has a special need child, and she talked about how the church has been a community for him where other people have kind of ostracized him, but she says he's got people that love him and people that have opened their arms and surrounded him. And she said, and he's not easy, but she says he's got a family of people that love him. And then after that, later that evening, there was other stories too, but later that evening after the class was done, I went home, and many of you know that my wife and I, for the last year and a half, we've been engaged in hosting children, doing transitional foster care. And so just a couple days ago, we had a new placement. We had a couple young boys from Haiti come into our home. Do I have any of my Haitian brothers and sisters here? Come on, where are you? We had a lot of our Haitian brothers and sisters at first service. Few of you are here this afternoon. Well, it's not this afternoon yet, pretty soon. Anyway, so we had some old bicycles at the house for them to ride, but one of them was already broke from the last kids that we had, and then I found out that another one of them broke. And later that night, we're in the house, and all of a sudden, we get a ring. I don't know, they knock on the door, ring the door, but all of a sudden somebody pulls up to our house. I can't tell you who the person was because I don't want to do that. But this person pulls up, open up the door of their van, and they begin to pull out 3 new bicycles and 2 scooters for the kids. And it was not asked for. There was no reason to do it other than it's just the love of Christ working through God's people. And these are just a couple of examples. I could go on and on and on. And I just want you to know that God is at work. He is building His kingdom through His church, and He is doing a beautiful work. And so, yes, we are not perfect, and we have our flaws, but let's follow the Holy Spirit, and we will be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. With that said, it's kind of my introduction, part of my introduction. So we talk about these kingdom ethics. Jesus is teaching his kingdom ethics in Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 7. And what he's doing is he's teaching authentic righteousness and how authentic righteousness is supposed to be lived out in our lives in contrast with the superficial self-righteousness of the religious leaders of his day. So that's what we see him doing in Matthew chapter 5 as it begins. He shows his contrast, and he does it by saying, you have heard, but now I say. So 6 different times we come across that statement in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus says, you have heard, but now I say to you, contrasting authentic righteousness with that old superficial self-righteousness, which was really not that the law was superficial, but the way that the law was interpreted, the way that they followed the law was more of a superficial self-righteousness. Last week we looked at 4 of those 6 statements that Jesus addressed, where he began with, you have heard, but now I say to you. Of those 4, 3 of them all had to deal kind of with the same issue, the issue of hatred. And we saw that Jesus is saying that authentic righteousness is where hatred is replaced by love. Hatred is replaced by love. And then he says that the other one dealt with the issue of lust. And he says that authentic righteousness is when true love replaces lust. And in both of those cases, with hatred and lust have a tendency to depersonalize and dehumanize people. And as we talked about last week, hatred and lust, they're the seed that leads to the weeds of retaliation, violence, murder, and adultery. So Jesus is saying to us that he is calling his people, those who are the salt of the earth and the light of the world, who are his true kingdom people, living under his rule and his reign. We will be people that manifest the true love of Jesus Christ, his righteous love that is in contrast to hatred and lust. Today we're going to look at the 2 remaining statements of Jesus, 2 remaining topics he addresses, where he begins, you have heard, and now I say, and we're going to start with what Jesus has to say about divorce and remarriage. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 to 32, we'll begin here, and here's what Jesus says. He says, you have heard the law that says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce. But I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, more literally, except for the case of immorality, he says, causes her to commit adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. Now, those are some hard words, hard to kind of understand. What does Jesus mean by that? We're going to come back to them in a moment, but to help us get a better understanding of these brief statements, we want to look at Matthew chapter 19. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 3 through 10, we have a more detailed teaching of Jesus on this same issue, where he repeats these same ideas. But again, it'll help us, when we look at Matthew chapter 19, it'll help us make sense of what we just read here in Matthew chapter 5. So, Matthew chapter 19, verse 3, here's what we read. Some Pharisees came and tried to trap him with this question. Should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? Haven't you read the scriptures? Jesus replied. They record that from the beginning, God made them male and female. And he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the 2 are united into one. Since they are no longer 2 but 1, let no one split apart what God has joined together. Well, then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away? They asked. Jesus replied, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts, but it was not what God had originally intended. And I tell you this, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery, unless his wife has been unfaithful. Jesus' disciples then said to him, if this is the case, it is better not to marry. Now we got to unpack this. This would not be a good time to leave the service, because there have been, over the years, many, many misunderstandings, misconstruings of what Jesus says here. So let's get some background here. The religious leaders of Jesus' day are trying to pull Jesus in, draw Jesus in to a religious debate that was going on at the time between two Jewish schools of interpretation regarding the Old Testament Mosaic law about divorce. And the Old Testament law, it said that a man could divorce his wife if he found indecency in her. And so the debate was, what does he mean by that? What is indecency? And there's a more conservative school that said more what Jesus is saying, that it must be immorality on her part, but there were others that interpreted as indecency as anything I don't like, right? You burnt the toast, out with you. So this is what's going on. So they come to Jesus, they want to draw him in to the debate, and they want to test him. It says they wanted to trap him. So that tells us their motives are not genuine. Their motives, they're not really interested in knowing the truth. But look how Jesus responds. Jesus responds and he deals with the improper motivation behind their question. And Jesus says this. He says, you're religious leaders. You haven't read your own scriptures? I'm kind of putting this in my own language. You're the religious leaders. You don't even know Genesis? You don't even know the beginning of the Mosaic law, what God says? So then he tells them what it says. He says, basically, if you knew your own scriptures, which you're supposed to be teachers of, then you would know that God designed marriage to be a one-flesh union between one male and one female. Jesus quotes from Genesis, says, if you knew, you would remember what God said, that for this reason a man will leave his mother and father, and he will cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And then on that statement from the Old Testament, Jesus now gives his own commentary, which is, therefore, what God has joined together, let no man split apart or tear apart. What God has joined together, let no man tear apart. Jesus is saying this. In essence, what Jesus is saying is, you're so busy trying to figure out the loopholes in the law or find justifications for you to send your wife away, when what you should be focused on is not finding out justified reasons for divorce. What he's saying is you should be thinking about how do we maintain the bond that God has created, because the two have become one, and when the two are one, if we break this up, it requires a tearing. How many of you understand that? I realize I'm addressing a topic today that I know is very painful for people. I understand that. Would you just rely on the grace of God right now? If you have some of the pains from experiencing divorce and experiencing what we're talking about right now, just rely on the grace of God to hear what he wants to say to you today. I want to say this very clearly. When Jesus speaks against divorce, it does not mean that Jesus hates divorced people. As we see, and we're going to continue to see as we look at this, Jesus is speaking against those who have acted unfaithfully to the person that they've entered into a covenant with. That is what he's doing. So let's continue on with what happens in Matthew chapter 19. They respond after Jesus says to them, what God has joined together, do not separate. Basically saying, stop trying to figure out when it's okay to divorce and start working on how to nurture the relationship you have. They come back with, well, wait a second. Wait a second. I mean, then why did Moses command us to give the wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? And there's something very manipulative in their question, because it's almost, although they don't say Moses commanded us to divorce, they're kind of implying that, well, Moses commanded us that we could divorce her. We just need to give her a certificate. And Jesus responds. He responds to their conscious distortion of Moses' command with this very strong response. He says, Moses only permitted divorce because of your hardness of heart, because of your rebellious spirit. That's why he did that. He permitted it. And what Moses did was Moses commanded the certificate of divorce. The whole purpose of that certificate was to be a safeguard for the woman, to protect her. Because in ancient Near Eastern civilizations, for a woman to be single without a husband, it was very difficult for a woman to survive. So for a husband to send his wife away, if she did not have the prospects of remarriage, her economic survival was at risk. And so what Moses was doing is he's not saying, fine, divorce her with this certificate. He's saying, you're going to divorce her, which you shouldn't. You have to at least give her a certificate of divorce so at least she can remarry and not be considered, because without that certificate, people would consider, well, maybe she's still married. I can't marry a married woman. So this is what's going on here. And Jesus says he permitted it. He didn't command it. He permitted it because of your hardness of heart, because of your rebellious spirit. And then Jesus says this. He says, depending on your translation, when we read earlier, Jesus said, and I tell you, but here's the force of it. It's more like, and let me tell you something. You ever have a conversation with somebody and they come back with, and let me tell you something. Well, that's what Jesus is saying to them. And I will say this, if Jesus speaks to you that way, let me tell you something, that means that you're in trouble. That means you better listen. So he says, let me tell you something. He says, if you divorce your wife, except in the extreme case of immorality on her part. So yes, there is an exception clause in here, but the exception is an extreme exception for immorality on her case. He says, if you divorce her and you marry another woman, he says, you're committing adultery. Now, most men were not divorcing their wives. Most men, and by the way, divorce, the literal word means to send her away. That's why you see that phrase. Most men were not divorcing their wife because of immorality on her part. Again, most of the time they're looking for some justification so that they can describe, so that their reason for divorcing their wife fits under the character of what Moses said, that indecency. So most of them they're not divorcing because of some extreme immorality on her part. And so when they hear Jesus say, you shouldn't even be thinking about the justification for divorce, the two are one, and you should not be separating what God joined together, they're shook up. They're shook up because Jesus is effectively eliminating their options for divorce. So here's the question. Why did Jesus compare getting divorced and remarried with adultery? Why did Jesus say this? And let me tell you this. If you divorce your wife, except for the extreme case of immorality, and you marry another woman, you are committing adultery. Why these? That sounds pretty strong. Remember what we've already talked about. In Matthew chapter 5 through 7, Jesus uses a lot of rhetoric. Jesus said that if your eye causes you to lust, gouge it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Was Jesus literally encouraging dismemberment of the bodies? No, we already looked at that last week. Jesus uses very strong rhetoric, very strong hyperbole to make a point. And here's what he's saying. I'll give you an example. If I can be unfaithful to my wife in two different ways. I could be unfaithful to my wife by having an affair and becoming sexually intimate with another woman while I'm married still to my wife. Or I could also be unfaithful to her by divorcing her so I can go be with another woman. Those two things, what he's saying, what he's trying to say to them, it's not much different. It might look different. You might be technically abiding by the law if you divorce her legally, give her a certificate of divorce, and then get remarried. But he says on a heart level, it's the same thing. At a heart level, you're leaving the woman that you made a covenant with to go be with somebody else. That's what he's talking about. That's the essence here of what's going on. Now, what's also very important and interesting in these words, as well as in Matthew chapter 5, 27 through 32, is that Jesus' emphasis on adultery is different than the emphasis of most of the Jews in Jesus' day. They usually, or their common conception of adultery, their basic concern was that it constituted the theft of another man's wife. So the reason why it was so bad is that if somebody, if a man commits adultery with a married woman, that, it's like he's stolen that man's wife. So the point is, the focus was the man on how the man has been harmed in the situation. But Jesus does not show favor to the man over the woman or the woman over the man. Jesus is saying that the concern is faithfulness to the marriage, faithfulness to the covenant. Jesus taught that a married man who either lusts after other women or who divorces his own wife to be with another woman, he says, while he hasn't technically broken the law, he's committed adultery. Not because he stole another woman, because he's broken his covenant. He's committed adultery. He has violated the covenant with his wife. In both cases, we have a lack of faithfulness being demonstrated. One other thing that's very important to notice from this teaching in Matthew chapter 19 is when Jesus appealed to the Genesis passage, saying that, you've read that God created the male and female, and that for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh, right? The two will become one flesh. He said, therefore, what God has brought together, let no man separate. So Jesus emphasizes in this teaching that marriage is a covenant between two people. Two people, right? You see that? You notice that? There's a numerical limitation on Jesus' definition of marriage. Marriage is two people. It's not three people become one flesh. It's not four people. It's the two become one flesh. Where did Jesus get that numerical limitation from? Did he pull it out of the sky? Did he just say, you know what? I think it's good if people bond in pairs. No, the numerical limitation of two people in marriage is based upon the two-ness of the sexes, the two genders that God created, male and female. So here's why this is important. If we remove, right, let me put it this way, because we already did, as a society, when we remove the two complementary created sexes as the foundation for marriage, we have simultaneously removed any basis to limit the number of participants in marriage. There's just no other logic. There's no other way around it. The attempt to try to say that marriage doesn't have to be between one man and one woman, it can be any two people, begs the question, why does it have to be two people? Why? And there's no logical response. The reason why marriage is limited to two people is because God created two genders, male and female. And today, this is why we are hearing more and more talk, if you pay attention, more articles are being written about why, you know what, we don't really need monogamous relationships. This is why polyamory is becoming such a big thing in our society, where people are saying, and there's already in different places a push to open up marriage to more than two people. And that's because we took the train off the tracks. Once you take the train off the tracks, it's headed in any direction that the wind wants to take it, right? Or the forces of gravity want to take it. It is just running in a chaotic manner, and you know where it ultimately heads. It heads for a crash. It heads for a crash. The train is off the track. So that's not the main part of this message, but it's important to notice when people might ask you about your beliefs about marriage, Jesus defined marriage not only as a permanent covenant relationship, but as a permanent covenant relationship that is monogamous, and it is monogamous because God created us male and female. Okay, so now I want to go back to Matthew chapter 5, and I want to go back to this statement that if it didn't trouble you when you first read it, you probably didn't pay close enough attention. Listen to what Jesus says. But I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, unless she has committed immorality, causes her to commit adultery. Causes her to commit adultery. Now, remember what we already said. In Judaism, if the man was going to divorce his wife, he had to at least give her a certificate of divorce so she could justifiably get remarried. Without that certificate, she could not remarry. So this is important to understand that in Judaism, remarriage was almost expected. It doesn't mean that everybody got remarried. In fact, if the woman had committed adultery, they were actually commanded to divorce her. And in that case, she shouldn't be remarried. But for other cases, all other cases, the woman needed that. It was a protection, so she could be remarried. So what we have going on here is we have this statement. It sounds like when you first read it that Jesus is saying that the woman, if you divorce your wife, now you make her an adulteress. It's like, well, why would Jesus say that? It almost sounds like she's getting blamed for something he did. But pay attention. to what he said. He said, the one who divorces his wife, he causes her. The responsibility is not being placed on the woman who's been divorced, who's been sent away. Jesus is placing the responsibility on the man who sent her away. He's saying, you are causing her to commit adultery. Now, that still begs the question, well, why should she be guilty of adultery? Isn't remarriage allowed? Jesus even said in these exceptions. So the reason is that, again, Jesus is using rhetorical speech to make for an effect, not to be precise. What he's saying is essentially this. He's saying that what you have done is you've put her in a position where she's not able to be faithful to you. She would be faithful to you, but you sent her away. You divorced her. So Jesus is saying to the man, it's your fault that you put her in a position of getting remarried and now establishing a covenant with another man when she should have been faithful to the first marriage. So again, the responsibility is not being placed on the woman. She's the victim in this case of the man sending her away without justification, and remarriage is just the expected necessary response of her. So that's what's going on here. Again, Jesus, in all of his teachings here, there's rhetoric, and all these you have heard, but I say. So let's go through them again. Notice Jesus says, hatred and anger is like murder. Remember what we said last week? Is hating somebody the same as murdering them? No, it is not the same. Is cursing someone the same as murdering them? I said it last week. If you have a choice between cursing me or murdering me, please curse me. All right? So he's not saying that anger is murder. What he's saying is that the seed and the weed are so closely associated, they are of the same nature. So again, Jesus said anger and hatred are like murder. He said lust, sexual lust, is like adultery. And now he's saying unjustified divorce and remarriage is also like adultery. He's trying to say how it is of the same nature. You're doing the same thing. And his concern through all of this, his concern is about faithfulness. His concern is about faithfulness. His concern is that his people, kingdom people, that we will be faithful to the relationships, and especially to this most sacred relationship, the marriage relationship, to be faithful. So the response of the religious leaders when they hear Jesus say this, when Jesus says that what God has joined together, let no man separate, and that then he goes on to say, and if you divorce your wife and go marry another woman, he says you're an adulterer. They're like, oh my goodness. Jesus, he has just stripped away any of my opportunity to get rid of my wife and go get another woman, to trade her in for another model. He's like, Jesus he's ruined it. And so here's how they respond. They said, oh my goodness, I guess it's better not to get married. I want you to know that's not God speaking, that's men speaking, men whose hearts are corrupt. What they're saying is, wait, if I don't have the option of divorce, well, then I don't even want to get married. Whenever I do a wedding, I tell anybody that I'm going to lead in their vow, exchanging their vows, that if they can't say to me that they're committing to one another for life and that they're not entering into this relationship with keeping a little door open that, okay, except, it's not until we divorce, it's until death do us part. Not until divorce do us part. I won't do a wedding unless I know that those people can stand before me and say, we are in this for the long haul. We are in this until death do us part. And that's what Jesus is saying. It is, the marriage relationship is a covenant. It is a covenant relationship. It is not a relationship of convenience. Let me say it again. It is a covenant relationship. It is not a relationship of convenience. It is a sacred covenant, not a social construct. What I mean by that, a social construct means that society constructs marriage. If society has constructed marriage, then society can deconstruct marriage and make it anything we want it to be. But marriage is a sacred covenant. Sacred means it was instituted by God, belongs to God. He has created it. And so therefore, I don't have the right to deconstruct what God has constructed. And here's the bottom line. The whole Sermon on the Mount, the kingdom ethics is about love. It's about love. That's what authentic righteousness is. And love is not easy, but it is beautiful. Love is not easy, but it is beautiful. Love is not easy. You know what's easy? Hating is easy. Or am I the only one? Yeah. Hating, what's easier, to love your enemy or to hate your enemy? Loving is not easy. Hating is easy. Fulfilling our sexual desires is not difficult. Denying our flesh is difficult, right? Staying committed is not easy. Walking away when things get difficult, when things are hard, that's easy. That's the easy stuff. Love is not easy. Staying committed to somebody who is emotionally, physically, or spiritually not well is not easy. Like I said, walking away is easy. Often. As I was thinking about this, I started praying to Jesus. I said, Jesus, was loving easy for you? Jesus, was loving easy for you? Here's what Jesus said to me. He said, Randy, are you asking me, was it easy for me to love people who didn't listen to a word I told them? He said, Randy, are you asking me, was it easy to love people that walked away from me? Are you asking me if it was easy to love people that were constantly demanding my time and my energy and wouldn't leave me alone, give me a minute to rest? Randy, are you asking me if it was easy to love those who abandoned me, who rejected me, who denied me, who betrayed me, who mocked me, who slandered me, who slapped me, who beat me, who killed me? Are you asking me if it was easy to love them? No, it wasn't easy. But how many of you know that Jesus' love was beautiful? Jesus' love, it wasn't easy, but it is the most beautiful love ever demonstrated. The love of Jesus for us when he went to that cross. And he allowed himself to be crucified for us. Jesus' love wasn't easy, but it sure was beautiful. It sure was pleasing to the Father. And in the end, Jesus' love is what conquers all. Jesus' love is what conquered sin. Jesus' love is what conquers all of the effects of sin. And the reason that we're going to dwell in the presence of God for all eternity in that new creation with no more sin, no more Satan, no more sorrow, no more suffering, no more sickness, no more death is because Jesus was willing to love when it wasn't easy. When it wasn't easy. Marriage can be a battle, so I want to talk to the married people today. Marriage, it's not that marriage can be a battle. Marriage is a battle. Marriage is a battle, but hear me clearly. Married people, yes, marriage is a battle, but make sure that you are fighting, that when you are fighting with each other, you are not fighting against each other, but for each other. Okay, let me say that again. Marriage is a battle. When you are married, you will find yourself fighting with one another. But you can fight with one another without fighting against one another. You can fight with one another. What I mean by that is you fight shoulder to shoulder, fight the same enemy. Not fighting against, fighting with and for one another. So yes, marriage is a battle. Get in the battle, fight for one another. Let me remind you what Peter said. Peter said, husbands, he said, honor your wives. Wives, respect your husbands. I don't know how you read that, but I read that with a very equal responsibility placed on both parties. Both parties are called to honor one another. And here's why, because we're one. The two have become one, flesh. One thing I would recommend you not do is do not spit into the wind. Have you ever tried that? Do not raise your hand right now. I don't advise it. Do not spit into the wind. You know what happens when you spit into the wind. I don't need to describe it for you. When we dishonor our spouse, married people, when we curse our spouse or demean our spouse or degrade our spouse with our words or our actions, it is like spitting into the wind because the two have become one flesh. And what I do to my wife, I do to myself. What I do to my wife, I do to myself because we're one. Now, that also means that when I bless my wife, So I will tell you, you know what? Bless into the wind all you want. When you bless your spouse, you're blessing into the wind. That blessing comes back to you because the two have become one flesh. So husbands and wives, fight together, not against one another. Fight with one another, for one another, not against one another. From there, I want to go to the sixth. Actually, it's not sixth in order, but the last one we're going to address, you have heard, but I say to you statement, Matthew chapter 5, 33 through 37, as we kind of wrap this up. When you first read this, you might think it has nothing to do, as if I'm starting a whole nother message. No. Listen carefully. What you're going to hear now from Jesus is very, very much related to what we've just talked about. So let's listen to what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, 33 to 37. He says, again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. What is he talking about? The issue that is at hand here is the issue of being people who are faithful to our word, people of integrity, people of honesty, people who are reliable, people who are trustworthy. He's dealing with not a specific law in the Old Testament, but in the Old Testament, there are a number of different laws that dealt with taking an oath. An oath is when you make a promise. When two people get married, they make promises to one another. They exchange their vows. In all life, we sign contracts, right? In business, we're making a promise. We sign a contract. What he is saying is for the kingdom people, those that are motivated by the Holy Spirit, empowered by the Holy Spirit, we don't have to say, okay, I swear to God that I'm telling you the truth. Or I swear to God that I'm going to do such and such, whatever I'm going to do. He's saying we don't need to do that. We don't need to do that. Craig Keener, in his commentary on Matthew, writes this. He says, the way that these oaths have been constructed in Judaism, he says, is the further removed the oath was from the actual name of God, the less danger they faced for violating it. So people swore by heaven or earth or Jerusalem or one's head or God's throne. They were doing this because that way, if they broke their promise, the danger to them wasn't as great as if they actually swore on God's name. So they're swearing on something else. It's kind of like, today people say, well, I swear on my mother's grave or I swear on my father's grave. And it seems like, well, maybe that's not as bad as saying I swear to God, because if I swear to God and then I'm not really being honest, God's going to get me. I don't know about you, but my father and my mother, they could probably get me as well as God. And they had a really good way of getting me if I did wrong, but that's a whole nother message. I found that this is interesting. I found out that the pinky swear. We got some young people over here. Do you do the pinky swear? Do they still do that? Do you have any idea what that is? When I was young, okay, Pastor Manos, the pinky swear. I found out that originated in Japan, from what I read. And here's what they would do: when you locked pinkies and you swore that what you were saying was true, if it turned out not to be so, or if you were making a promise and swearing through the pinky swear on your promise, if you broke your promise or what you said wasn't true, you had to cut off your pinky. You had to cut it off, right? Then you got to go to the next finger. And then pretty soon you're walking around What Jesus is saying is that, my people, you don't need to swear to God. Because when you say, Pastor, I swear to God I didn't do it. Why are you doing that? Why don't you just tell me I didn't do it? The reason we do this is it's a tacit acknowledgement that normally, under normal situations, you really can't believe me. But now, this time, I'm really telling you the truth because I'm swearing to God. You follow? Jesus is saying, you should be the type of person that people trust. You don't need to swear to God or swear on your mother's grave or your father's grave or swear any other. You don't need to do a little pinky thing. You just need to let your yes be yes and your no, no. So the bottom line here is this is about faithfulness. God's people are faithful people. We do what we say we're going to do. God's people are people who stick to their commitments. They're people who are reliable, who are trustworthy. We keep our word. We speak the truth. And this applies not just to marriage, but in all of your relationships, We need to be faithful people. That is the call of God on our lives today. We're going to wrap this up as the worship team comes. I want to read to you a story. It goes back to that point about, listen, commitments, being faithful to our commitments, following through on what we say, it's not always easy. Being committed is not easy in all kinds of areas of life. Committed to your job, committed to your spouse, committed to your children, committed to your parents, right? Commitment's not easy. But the committed life, the faithful life is beautiful because it reflects our God, who is the ultimate, absolute faithful one. David Ireland was dying of a crippling neurological disease. His wife was pregnant. And so he began to write a bunch of letters, knowing that he might never see the child that his wife was carrying, there was a very good chance he knew that he was going to die before this child was born. So he began to write letters to his unborn child, things that he wanted that child to know that he might never have the chance to speak to that child. His letters later became published in a book titled Letters to an Unborn Child. I want to read one of those letters to you. It was a letter that he wrote to his unborn child about the faithful love of his wife for him. Again, remember, David Ireland, who's writing, is dying of a crippling neurological disease, and what he's writing is about the love of his wife for him. He says to his unborn child, "Your mother is very special. Few men know what it's like to receive appreciation for taking their wives out to dinner when it entails what it does for us. It means that she has to dress me, shave me, brush my teeth, comb my hair, wheel me out of the house and down the steps, open the garage and put me in the car, take the pedals off the chair, stand me up, sit me in the seat of the car, twist me around so I'm comfortable, fold the wheelchair, put it in the car, go around to the other side of the car, start it up, back it out, get out of the car, pull the garage door down, get back into the car, and drive off to the restaurant." And then it starts all over again. She gets out of the car, unfolds the wheelchair, opens the door, spins me around, stands me up, seats me in the wheelchair, pushes the pedals out, closes and locks the car, wheels me into the restaurant, then takes the pedals off the wheelchair so I won't be uncomfortable. We sit down to have dinner, and she feeds me throughout the entire meal. And when it's over, she pays the bill, pushes the wheelchair out to the car again, and reverses the same routine. And when it's over, finished, with real warmth, she will say to me, "Honey, thank you for taking me out to dinner." Is that easy? That's not easy. Is that beautiful love? That is beautiful love. That is a beautiful love. That every single one of us here wants somebody to love us like that. Well, there's somebody that has loved us, a love that's even greater than that. It's the love of Jesus for us. And because of Jesus' love for us, he wants to work in our hearts by the Spirit and enable us. When I first read that story years and years ago, and I've shared that, some of you maybe heard it before, I've used it, and I will continue to use it because it is a powerful example of beautiful, difficult love. Difficult, beautiful love. Hard, difficult, but beautiful love. First time I read it, I said, "Lord, could I do that? Could I do that? Could I love my wife that way?" I know I can by the grace of God and the power of the Holy Spirit. Without the grace of God, power of the Spirit, I don't think I could do that. Come on, let's stand, let's worship him, and let's